Okay, today I want to compare the styles of George R.R. Martin and Tolkien. And interestingly enough, I've read these two back to back. I'm not quite done with everything that George R.R. Martin has written, but I feel like I'm far enough into the first book of the Game of Thrones series to kind of get a feeling for his style. And I want to compare these because I think it's an extremely interesting concept. What is a hero? What makes a good ruler? What makes a good king? Is the ends ever justifying the means? Is that ever something that we can come to grips with? And in particular, I want to talk about one scene from the first book, which is A Game of Thrones. And I want to talk about Aragorn because I think these ideas are kind of one's coming from a realistic perspective and one's coming from a mythological perspective. And if you're not familiar with either of these works, I think both of these authors have a lot to really tell you and really teach you about the world. I think they're both great authors in their own right, and I'm not throwing shade to one or the other. I personally lean more towards Tolkien. His style is more engrossing. His style is more idealistic, which I find more fascinating. But George R. R. Martin certainly is great at portraying political strife and all sorts of these things. But I really want to talk about Aragorn first because Aragorn is the perfect hero. He was born with nobility and becomes king. And Tolkien's basically his summation of the world is that when there's a good king, when the king is a good man, then the world is safe. When the king is nice, when he's honorable, when he has all of these things, that ensures the greatest idea for the kingdom. And interestingly enough, Tolkien actually did a translation of Beowulf, which I think should have showed him the opposite. If you've never read Beowulf, basically there's a great hero, he becomes king, and as he's aging, he's a great king, but he decides to go fight a dragon and ultimately ends up dying, leaving his kingdom without a king, leaving it without security. And it's interesting because it almost talks about self-sacrifice and when to self-sacrifice, when to go and forego your worldly responsibilities for the seeking out of greatness. And I think it's interesting, but it's weird that Tolkien decided to write Aragorn in the sense that once the plot is over, it's basically hinted that everything is perfect, as Aragorn is this great hero, he's this great man, and he becomes a great king. But what George R. R. Martin does differently is there's a scene early on in the Game of Thrones, and it doesn't spoil too much. It's not really anything about the plot devices, but I'll paint a picture of the scene to exemplify more of George R. R. Martin's worldview in a sense. And if you know anything about A Game of Thrones, most of the characters are somewhat Machiavellian. Some of them are perfect heroes, but he usually ends up killing them off way before they could actually improve anyone's lives. And it seems that the indication from this writing style is that the people that are honorable and the people that are just in their actions are not the people that rise to power and stay in power, because it's inherently a dirty game. Politics are always stabbing each other in the back for the sake of your own career, for the sake of your own neck. And the scene that I want to talk about is the scene where Robert Baratheon, the king that was a great warrior but is a bad king, basically he finds out that the successor to the throne that he usurped, that he basically stole their line of succession, they have a child, and he's like, you know what, we got to get rid of this child. And his best friend Ned Stark, I'm sure if you've seen the Game of Thrones TV show, you know who Ned Stark is, but he's this honorable man, and he's a man that puts his honor before everything else, and he'll be damned if he will ever sacrifice his values for the sake of anything. And that's really what he's about. And in this scene, it exemplifies that he basically wrote his death warrant with this scene. And what happens is that everyone in the room aside from him is justifying whatever steps they have to take in order to prevent future bloodshed. But what they have to do is sacrifice an innocent life. They have to sacrifice a young individual. They have to sacrifice a child. And it's really a gripping scene, because the implications of this is that there's only two people in the room that are against it, and these are the only two people that should rule, but these are the people with the least amount of say, the people with the least amount of power. And it's interesting because it kind of juxtaposes what's right versus what is good. And this is ultimately what Machiavelli talks about in The Prince. Machiavelli states that the best ruler puts the state before everything. so you must have the ends justify the means. You must be a utilitarian. You must crack a few omelets to make an egg. And it's something I disagree with, and perhaps this is why I dislike politics so much, but it's really interesting to analyze the political sphere, and especially through the medieval setting, because I feel like it can get away from the identity politics that are talked about today. But, I thought this was just an interesting comparison between Tolkien and George R. R. Martin, and, some of the ideas that one embraces and the other that one rejects. And, not to shade anything against either of these authors. I really do like both of them, but it's just cool to compare styles, because when you compare styles, I think it allows you to kind of see what you like, see what you don't like. Through comparison, we're able to, further the details and further the intentions of the author. So, yeah, let me know if you want me to compare more authors that I enjoy, more authors that I think are similar but have some key differences. One that's sticking in my mind right now is I can compare Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But again, love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.